semester, and it's great to see so many students, and I realize that this must have, I hope it must have some interest, and I hope that the talk today bears that out. I do want to thank David Kim for your extraordinary efforts putting this together really very quickly, and everything has been wonderfully smooth, so thank you. And also thanks to the Dean's office and the college for bringing me here. I'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and mainly through interactive media. So there's very few PowerPoint slides that I want to show you, but I do want to have a couple of concepts sort of at the forefront of our analysis. And I'm going to take you through a number of projects that blend, I would say, three aspects: research, teaching, and service together. Really kind of the pillars of, I think, a college or university. And all these projects begin to really see some very interesting overlaps between those areas. The other thing I want to point out is it's not really just kind of a funny thing to link digital humanities with the underscore there, but we've taken a lot of time, and this is actually how we're publishing the volume at MIT called Digital Humanities, to think about that yoke, that connector between digital and all the things that represents and the long traditions of the humanities, which obviously extend significantly farther and deeper and more globally, at least I think up until maybe the last century with regards to the digital. So that how those two terms are connected, whether the digital modifies the humanities, or whether the humanities in fact could modify the digital, I think is a very interesting question. So these are I'm only going to give you one slide which has some concepts on it, but this is the slide, and I'll come back to these things over and over again. And all I want to tell you is that the humanities are generally about interpretive work, the interpretive work of our cultural record. And that means we're not only designing that cultural record, but we're also helping to interpret it, make sense of it, and we're doing this in different formats perhaps today than traditionally. And these formats are hyper-mediated, or they're mediated in many different ways. And so we privilege, I think, in the digital humanities, questions of what might be called knowledge design. That is to say, we're really thinking about modes of interactivity, so questions of interface. How does someone interact with this material? Of course, the book itself is a kind of interface. One is turning pages. One is thinking about layout. One thinking about design. And it's not as if other media forms didn't have design or interactivity. It's just that we become more and more aware of that interactivity through the multiplicity of digital formats. Ambiguity, something I want to really stress here. Much of what the humanities does is focus on perspective, the ambiguous data, not the ones and zeros, the yes or no, the if or then, the computational domain. It focuses on interpreting really the complexity of the human condition in perhaps the realm of the computational. And so here you have an interesting kind of almost tension of sorts. Computation is so much about disambiguation. And what do you do with a whole tradition that's all about ambiguity, right? So what do we do with humanities? Humanities provide context, comparison, and also historical perspective. All of these things continue to matter in the digital humanities. We don't throw these things out. It's not as if suddenly we've said, aha, all these traditions that have really formed what the humanities are about continue to inform the digital humanities in very fundamental ways. It's no longer theory versus practice. You don't have people theorizing on one side and practitioners on the other. You have ways of integrating theoretical and methodological approaches into practice. And here, the things I'm going to be talking about are primarily these two. What I call critical curation. So basically, a kind of curation is a term from exhibitions. So in terms of organizing material, selecting it, making it into a narrative, and what we're calling thick mapping. So maps that have thickness, dimensionality, and particularly time. So all this is to say the public, I think, is expanding in lots of interesting ways, and research is entering into the public in also a number of new ways. The project that I'll talk about primarily is actually a project that I founded at UCLA back in 2002 called Hypercities, and it has a very relatively simple concept. And I guess that concept has changed a little bit over the years, but the concept is basically this. You're using Google Maps or Google Earth, and you say, it's great, I can find traffic directions. I can go from here to here, and here to here, and I can, so forth, see where things are. But if you want to go back in time, you can't do that. And I thought, back in time kind of would be interesting, because that would tell you a lot about context, ambiguity, perspective, tell you a lot about the way in which cities and spaces have changed over time. And so the whole idea was basically to build a platform that allowed one to think about time. So you might say time travel. And this I'll go into it with in some detail. The easiest way to think about this is kind of like layers. And so here's Google satellite imagery. It often is not updated regularly, so you often have satellite imagery that may be several years old. But you also have historical satellite imagery, also in Google. You don't really have historical maps, and historical maps become one of the bases for beginning to think about this notion of time travel. A couple of things that historical maps offer, not only representations of how cities used to look, but also kind of ideals. Maps are not necessarily, they don't have to reflect reality, they can be interpretations of reality. And insofar as they do that, maps can be ideological, especially in the ones I'll show you in Berlin. You have maps that really foreground, I think, some very difficult and complex political issues. Maps from the 1930s created by the Nazis are very different objects than maps that may have been produced earlier or later. But what's happened over the last couple of years, and I think particularly the last 5 or so years, you have a wide range of participatory technologies emerging. Social technologies, ones that begin to not only allow people who are outside maybe the traditional purview of the humanities to contribute knowledge, but also the taking of knowledge outside of those traditional venues. So you have kind of this expanded notion of a flexible public sphere. And I'll end by talking about a Twitter mapping project that I've been working on for about the past year. I think it exemplifies this. This might be kind of our sort of my theoretical premise of the whole thing. And I do want to read this to you because I think it tells you a lot. Benjamin was a very important German Jewish philosopher who actually, his last year of life was 1940. He was fleeing the Nazis, and when he thought that he wouldn't be able to survive, he committed suicide. And he was an extensive commentator on modernity, and particularly studied Paris. So the place that he studied much was walking in the streets of Paris. And a flaneur is a person walking down the streets. It's a kind of figure from modernism, from Poe and Baudelaire. And this person walks in the street and takes in the sensory environment of the big city, the hustle and bustle, the crowds, the lights, that kind of thing. But for Benjamin, the street conducts the flaneur into a vanished time. And so here we come back to that notion of time travel. For him, as the flaneur walks the street, he's conducted, or she's conducted backward in time. The street's precipitous. It doesn't lead outward, it leads downward, into a past that can be all the more spellbinding because it's not his own, meaning it's kind of foreign, right? It's far away. And so I thought, how do you embody that principle? What if you take Google Maps, Google Earth, and try to embody this Benjaminian principle in thinking about how to design an approach to the study of city spaces? And so that's where we came up with the Hypercities project. And there's a number of exemplary places we've been looking at. Berlin was the first city that I sort of began this work in, partly because of my training as a Germanist, but also because it's a city that was marked by many absences and memories and traumas and built and rebuilt and cut in half and put back together again. And it was an exemplary place for trying to look at the way the past haunted. Also been working in Los Angeles, largely because I'm based in Los Angeles, so we've been doing a number of mobile-based projects in LA on handheld devices that begin to feed historical data into GPS-enabled handhelds in order to, again, add depth to the experience in the present, to conduct people downward in time, right? And these projects have been done in collaboration between UCLA and a number of high schools where we put the historical maps and information on phones that are GPS connected, and these create tours, so to speak, historical tours of neighborhoods, and I'll talk a little about that. We also imagine tours that are both fictional and real, sometimes taking historical sources and melding them together, following in someone's footsteps, and in fact using data that's available in libraries. We worked with Stanford Libraries and UCLA, taking memoirs and putting them into these devices so you could follow in the footsteps of a person. And the other thing that we've been doing is looking at, and this goes on the side of research, really thinking what kind of new research platforms might be emerging to support this kind of work. And one of the projects I'll show you a little bit later is a project, a three-dimensional project, realized largely in Google Earth of the Roman Forum in 404 of the Common Era. So a project that's now gone through a lot of iterations, actually, over several years, and has now kind of emerged as a completed thing. The last thing I'll talk about is Twitter. And this is actually from the tsunami. Twitter data that we gathered Twitter data in a number of places. In Egypt during the so-called in Tahrir Square, in Libya, we were gathering Twitter data from Syria, and this is Twitter data primarily from a region around Sinai, which was inundated by the tsunami. This is a map, a GIS platform, so it brings together geographic information data together with Twitter data. And the idea here is that the Twitter data is real-time data, and there were around 600,000 tweets from this region that we gathered over a period of a couple of weeks following the tsunami. And I'll end actually with this project. All right, so let's go to some stuff that's live, because it's more interactive and I think instructive. Let's see if this is still on here. I might just restart this just to make sure my connection is safe. Yeah, it is. So this is sort of HyperCities as a project, and there's a number of these little red dots to signify cities where things are happening, and by things are happening, that is, there's groups working on some aspect of the history of those cities. Wellington, New Zealand is kind of this seems like an outlier, but there's a group of high schools there who actually came. A teacher came to Los Angeles to learn how it worked, and they're very interested in using it as a way of dealing with their own aspects of history and internal colonization. Berlin is perhaps has some of the most let's say data associated with it, and some of the things that as this project begins. It begins largely with historical maps that can be overlaid onto the present. So this is 1772. And if you know Berlin, this is the city center. This form of the city center remained largely intact for several centuries. What's interesting for me as I look at these maps is, I can make sure I can zoom in here nicely, is that you have the ability to zoom in and out and kind of read maps with a lot of detail. But you also have the ability to trace what I would call absences and presences. This little E right here, in fact, is the first synagogue in Berlin, just interestingly enough, located there. And if you're there in the present looking for the synagogue, you would find that it's this location right there, so I can make it a little better for you. It's the interior courtyard of a parking lot of a building now. There's no record of it whatsoever, it's right there. But on the map, it's there. And this already kind of illustrates an interesting question for me. So notice where it comes back, E. There it is. This illustrates an interesting question to me about how historical maps can be used to begin to talk about memory or places of absence. And I've used quite a number of these historical maps that we have, I think there's 41 it says there, of Berlin, and especially many during the 18th and 19th century, to locate places of absence, places that if you're there in the present you can't see, but they're there on the map at some point. And trying to understand when they're there or not there is a fascinating and important question. We also have the ability, this is perhaps the more relevant or interesting thing, is the ability to create collections. So essentially to add voices, information, names, basically to add projects to the maps. And this is where, in fact, student projects, I think, come in really quite interestingly and very powerfully. And when I teach a course on Berlin, and I've taught this class for a number of years, I use HyperCities as a textbook. So basically, everything in the class is online. So historical maps, we always start at a particular location when we drill down through time. All of the meetings are online, and in fact, the student projects are online. That is to say, they create projects. And so this one is like, they're always in collaboration, so Kimmy and John were the two. This particular project is on one particular location in Berlin where the royal palace, the so-called Stadtschloss, used to be. And what you can do in HyperCities is you create collections inside of collections. And so what they've done here is this is a collection inside of a collection. And this is a three-dimensional model that they created using SketchUp. And it's almost, it's not quite accurate, but it's close. It's accurate in terms of its dimensions. It's not quite accurate in terms of its placement on the location of where it was. And this is something that I recently discovered, because what you can do in Google is you can go back to around 1945 and look at the satellite imagery. Really extraordinary satellite imagery in Berlin and a number of other cities that were heavily bombed. And you can see this is where the royal castle actually was. And I can turn that off. Let me see. Oops. This is the location today. In fact, there's nothing there because it had its own. It had much more of. Let's see. There we go. Go back. Let's see if it'll stay there. That particular. There we go. So that's the royal castle bombed out. So why all the roofs here are missing is because Berlin was subjected to a very high, intense aerial campaign, and much of the city center was destroyed. This particular aspect of Berlin, this particular area, is actually a very kind of example of a place of memory and trauma and dislocation. So it used to be the location of this royal castle. Then it was bombed during the war. Then it was in the east, so it became part of the DDR. And they decided to get rid of the ruins and build their own castle on top of it, which was called the Palace of the Republic, which the students document here. And that building, too, doesn't exist anymore. And this building was put up in the 1970s, existed all the way until 2009, when it was literally unbuilt, as they say. The process of what's called Remapping, almost like building backwards. Why did this happen? Well, because it was considered to be kind of ideological. It was the seat, one of the seats of the communists, the People's Palace. And so, building spaces become spaces of contestation. And what the students wanted to do was to show one history of the Royal Palace, another history in the Palace of the Republic, and then today, the very fact of the matter is there's nothing there. In fact, they're rebuilding, as it turns out, a portion of the facade of the Royal Castle. So this particular project is interesting because it kind of illustrates a number of approaches in the digital humanities. One, the students had to think about design. So I mentioned earlier knowledge design. They had to think about how to stage a project that was not strictly linear, but in fact was kind of a series of collections within collections. And so as you navigate here, each part of their argument goes down, and there's a view associated with each portion. So they've assigned a view kind of look at over here. They've assigned, there's multimedia objects like a video or a photograph over here. And then there's aspects, as you'll see, there's more text, which is their interpretive part. So this is the history of this location as told by the students. So this is on the decision for demolition, and this is what we're seeing. It's satellite imagery, in fact, from 2000. Looks like it's updated already, 2012. This project was created in 2009, so there's even some movement, you might say, in how the students originally selected the imagery they wanted for their project. This was all done in 10 weeks. So basically, they learned the history of Berlin. They interacted in this format. They learned how to begin to think about conceptualizing a project in this format, and had to think through what kind of way in which the textual argument and the visual argument went hand in hand. And that was a critical thing, right? So basically, we're always linking arguments with a time-space junction of some sort. And that's what they were doing there. Let me show you a more recent project. I'll clear that one out, which we just did last year. And this one concerns, let's see, that's actually not going to work there. Actually, very well. Yeah, okay, we'll leave it in Google Earth mode. This one concerns Holocaust survivor stories. And so I've been teaching the last 2 years of what we call a service learning class at UCLA, where students, we happen to have a large survivor community living in Los Angeles. So people who were from Eastern Europe, were lost family during the Second World War and the Holocaust, survived, and managed to immigrate to the United States sometime after the war and rebuild their lives. And the way it worked is students would meet with survivors over a period of 10 weeks, learn their stories, and rather than doing kind of traditional oral histories or video histories, they learned the story, but they wanted to plot it out by time and place. So meaning where the person was born, what happened to them, and then all the way to Los Angeles. And the students are actually in the story themselves. So this is Alan Greenstein's story. Let me see if I can open this a little bit. I'll make this a little bigger so you can sort of see it side by side. And these are the two students. So this is Sonia and Kevin, and Alan is the survivor. And the story actually starts with meeting of the survivor. And so it starts in LA, it sort of starts in the present. And what they wrote here, Alan's story crosses paths with two freshmen from UCLA, Sonia Egan and Kevin Wijat, what started at a meeting between strangers had transformed into an unlikely friendship that crosses racial, religious, and cultural boundaries. Every other Wednesday over lunch at UCLA Hillel, the group met to discuss Alan's life. While the places he has been are far, the stories that he tells will always remain close to our hearts. And this is from 2011. And as you go through this, what the students did was they began with where he was born. So this is, he was actually born Abraham Grunstein. He later changed his name to Alan Greenstein. He was born in Poland. What the students did was they sat down with the survivor looking at Google Earth to try to, and this is often the first time the survivors have seen Google Earth, so it's mind-blowing for them as well, to find the locations of their homes or of their communities. It's really quite a powerful thing when you can actually put into Google Earth the name of the town, and then they can begin to actually, with the students, they can point out, oh, that was where the school was, or that was where the river was, and something about their history. It becomes extremely overwhelming for everybody. The students wrote this. It was actually, so written by Sonia and Kevin. Another two students actually did some of the formatting, Patrick and Andy, who are also students in my class. And as you go through this, it basically tells point by point what happened, where he went. Amazingly as well, if you haven't looked at Google Earth, there's quite a bit of evidence of where concentration camps were, like Auschwitz and Treblinka. You can see them today. And for many students, this is also very powerful. If you don't have the opportunity to go there, you can see them from the air. And that's possible because of the media. So in any case, what happens here as you go through the different pieces of the story, you've gone from place to place, and often the students have been able to digitize some of the primary sources that the survivor has shared with them, including this certificate, which actually was his liberation certificate from April 30th, 1945, from Buchenwald. And so they had brought this to share with the students. The students digitized it and put it in the context of the story. And so you have some really very powerful primary material that also is there along with, in the students' words, the story of the survivors. It ends by going forward. That is to say, most were in displaced persons camps, often in Germany. Sometimes they even were able to integrate. So this is Frankfurt in 1945, satellite imagery from Google. So again, another major German city destroyed by the war. Not quite to the extent that Berlin was, but significantly. And if you continue, eventually he immigrated to Canada, pictures from his family, and ending up again where we began in Los Angeles, where he met the students and they told his story. This is taken to yet another level. So I mentioned the research, teaching, and service kind of combining in digital humanities projects. One, because these maps are now part of a museum exhibition at the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, where people can look at the digital maps and the material the students created. And they also recorded audio tours for iPods. If you go to a museum, and sometimes you go to a museum, like you get a headset, and they tell you, the general history. This happened in 1933. Hitler came to power. 1936. This happened, and so forth. The idea was to tell survivor stories from the students' words. So what they did was they recorded MP3s and chunked up the story like this and put it on iPods. And as you go through the museum, you hear the students telling the survivor story in their own words, and then you can look at the maps that they created. So this is a project, kind of a hybrid project. Again, historical, cultural, service, research, teaching, all in one. And I think that's exemplary of what digital humanities is about. It's, again, providing context, it's providing depth. It's a kind of thick mapping that I think is also a question about responsibility and new uses of technology, ones that open up our understanding of history in really, I think, interesting ways. So I'm going to shift location now. Actually, go to LA, and so a different kind of project. And this is a project that we finished last year as well. And get this little error comes up. This project is sorry, it's a little bit. I can make the screen slightly bigger here. Let's see, we can put it on full screen mode. And yeah, this project is actually just about a single neighborhood in Los Angeles called Historic Filipino Town. Let me go like that. That location of this neighborhood is right here in downtown LA. And the project was a collaboration between UCLA students, a professor of history, a couple of professors of history at USC and UCLA, me as kind of the project director, the Hypercities project director, and quite a number of students who began doing video histories of their neighborhood and the ways in which it's changed over the course of the 20th century. And what it is basically a kind of neighborhood history. What is Historic Filipino Town? Why is it here? Personal stories, advocacy campaigns, community research. And part of the idea of this project was to have sort of what we call qualitative storytelling. So personal stories, primarily realized through Flickr photo streams and videos that were produced, and interviews that students did with their with members of their community. Sometimes their family, their parents, people in their community. So this is a map on top of a map, obviously. And I particularly think that the student stories are really quite, so sometimes they're particular families, in this case the Bubutan family. The Hi-Fi youth, these are Historic Filipino Town youth, who made their own videos. And these are really quite, it'll take a second to load. They're all in Vimeo, and for whatever reason, when it connects to Vimeo, it's slightly slow. But these are stories basically, about hopes and dreams. They're by 16 to 18-year-olds. I don't think I have sound here, but I can let this, so maybe this will play slightly. This was, this is a story of Manok, one of our
I'm 19 years old. My nickname is Manok. When I was, I think, in the 5th grade or 6th grade, I used to own a flying rooster. And since then, I began drawing chickens and playing with it.
Well, yeah, you can watch it. There's about 300 of them, and they're really, I mean, they range, of course, and depend if you're interested in a kind of ethnographic history of a neighborhood told by many generations. It's a fascinating trove of resources. But that itself, I think, is interesting. But what we wanted to do with the project was also to link what I would call social science data with humanities data, and so that's what this half is. A little half is around here. And so we had a lot of data sets, primarily by a number of professors that worked at USC who have been studying demographic change in LA, particularly immigration data, census data, and we wanted to link the two together. So we thought, this is interesting in itself, and that's interesting in itself, but if you brought them together, it's even more interesting, right? Because it's kind of that idea of thick mapping. Well, one way of thinking about mapping a community is through census data, right? You get information, statistics. Another is through personal stories. But if you can put the two together, it becomes even more. So among the kind of data things that we have, so this would be like median income of actually all neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So I can put this up. This is change over time data, and I should have to expand this a little bit because we're so moved in here. Maybe I can put a different map up so you can see this bit better. There you go. So what you're seeing here is by census tract from 1970, 80, 90, and 2000. So that's why there's 4 bars. So that's 2000, 90, and 80, and 70. And what you're seeing is relatively flat income levels, so median income levels in census tracts all over Los Angeles. And in this particular case, with regard to historic Filipino town, it's actually remarkably flat, as in quite a number of these areas around here. If you zoom out of the map a little bit, oops, this might be really bad, but let's see. You're going to see a lot of data in a second. It's going to be, there you go. Yeah. Because we have all of Los Angeles County. But you know, look at the transformation among some areas over time. And one looks at, you know, income disparities. One's certainly looking at why where certain minorities did settle, why they settled there, whether they were allowed to settle, things like that. And can connect it to all kinds of things, connect it to listening to what the youth are saying about their own ideas for the future, connecting with data that reflects, you know, the reality of the past. And so this is, you can kind of mix and match a lot of stuff. This is a project that I would say is great for mixing and matching stuff together. We have quite a number of variables that you can look at: age, education, population, occupation, housing, residence, median income, and you can always connect it as well with kind of the storytelling aspect. Let me, in the interest of time, just move to like 2 other projects I want to show you, and then we can open up to some discussion. And yeah, let me show you. Oh, see, Rome was built. Yeah, Rome. So yeah, not exactly built in a day, but sort of. This is actually a publication. Because I've been, I'm not sure if it may be reloaded, because sometimes it's the models are very heavy. One of the ideas that we had was taking this approach to thinking about scholarly research and how interactive scholarly research, well, what is interactive scholarly research? What is that dimension of the interactive? It's not just the reproduction of a still image on a page, but how both sides of the page are telling arguments. In this case, this is the Roman Forum in 404 of the Common Era in Google Earth through a number of archaeological models that were created by professors in the classics department, urban history, and architecture. Diane Favreau was the person behind this effort and a project she held called Rome Reborn, which is a project that has been going on at UCLA since the mid-90s. These models were repurposed, actually scaled down to fit within Google Earth. We had a man named Gregor Callis, who's a professor, art historian at University of Tennessee in residence. And in fact, there are 18, I mentioned this I think to a couple of you, there are actually 18 authors of this article. Gregor Callis is one of the main authors, but the idea of being able to realize a project in this kind of multimedia dimension is really quite a challenge. And again, the idea is sort of similar to before, where this part and that part go hand in hand. And so the idea here is he's looking at imperial processions in the Roman Forum. And as you move through the article, it takes you into different aspects of the Forum. And he's looking at things like what's called here the polemics of statue display. So particularly statues of emperors, imperial processions, ways of politics of memory and space. And each part of the argument is footnoted, not only the argument, but also there's a footnoting going on of the visual environment over here. So what these models are based on, where the evidence for these models came from, you know, in the literature at large. And that's kind of an interesting question. So this is a top-down video. You go back down into the, what's called Along the Sacred Way. It looks like it's maybe not loading a couple models there, but that's okay. We're on a pretty good connection here. And yeah, so in any case, this is has gone through peer review. It was actually sent out to a number of anonymous reviewers. This was something that was supported by the NEH and will now become published in Urban History, a peer-reviewed journal, as a fully digital project. And so it gives you an example of sort of what's possible, even on the sort of speak of the level of research for digital humanities. And there's all kinds of, I think, issues that we can talk about with regard to this, but I did want to put it out there as, you know, we're thinking about this on a number of levels. Let me end with the Twitter projects, because I think that's, they illustrate a number of interesting ethical questions that, and this is perhaps the most recent project that I've been working on. So this is, we did this project in about 3 days, around January 30th of, not this past year, but the year before. So basically when things started to look like something was happening in Egypt, and that social media was playing a role. And the idea here was we simply just wanted to take, Twitter has an API, which means that you can get data from Twitter, and you can create your own software using their data. You can essentially harvest it, or you can do something with it. And the idea was essentially very simple. We wanted to get data from Twitter that had a location parameter in it. And by location parameter, I mean it had some designation of a place where it was from, whether it was user provided or whether it was provided on a GPS-enabled device, a computer, or a phone. And we thought that if you got data from a region around Tahrir Square, real-time social media, we would visualize it on a map. So we thought, so what you're seeing is this April 22nd, 2012. It's 8:15 at night right now in Egypt, and this is live Twitter data from Egypt. So that's all you're seeing. It populates across the top. We actually changed this to a timeline in some of the other instantiations that we did. And we're actually also looking at hashtags. So one of the other things that we grab are hashtags like, as you can see, Tahrir, January 25th, and so forth. Most of the data, not most, I'd say more than half definitely is in Arabic, but a substantial amount, especially during the period of January, was in English. But what we also like to do is this go back in time thing. So this is we decided, well, we should archive this stuff. And what's amazing about this is the archive of a single day. So this is February 10th. This is the day before Mubarak resigned. And this is tweets by hour, so you know some of you have more than 3,000 or so. On February 11th, this is a Friday, you have a really intensification of Twitter activity, culminating actually at 6 p.m. with nearly 10,000 tweets. This is right when Mubarak was going to give his resignation speech. And I'll let's see if this will play. Let me see if we can change the feed, and we'll take a second to call up. Yeah, there we go. So now this is February 11th, 2011, 6 o'clock, 0 seconds. This is 2 seconds after 6 o'clock. And a number of these are actually in English, and they're talking about a speech that's coming. That is, Mubarak is going to take the stage. He's going to say something. Something's going to happen, and you sort of just you let it play out. You'll see a number of the same things come up more than once because you can. RT means retweet, so you can a tweet that has gone out can be retweeted by others. And in fact, we've studied what tweets are most retweeted in different sections. The reason the map changed is because the location of the person doing the tweet changed. Most of them are from Cairo, and most are centered somewhere in the city center. I should say that one of the things we did was if they were made from phones that had latitude and longitude, we actually ambiguated that data because one of the things we didn't know is, and we still don't know, is like what would happen if it was used by someone else to like track people down. It would be horrible for us to say, oh, we just want to study the archiving of a project, and now they've decided what a great archive this is to track people down and persecute them. So actually all the data in here is ambiguated down to around 1 mile, and that's about as granular as we kept it. And there are reasons for that. I think interesting ethical questions when one thinks about social media data, especially in very contested spaces. One wonders how do you handle this in an ethical way, a responsible way. And I'm not necessarily sure that we've figured that out, but I at least wanted to realize that part of what we wanted to do was recognize the voices that were contributing to a transformed public sphere and have a way of archiving that. Twitter makes their archive available, by the way, for 5 days, and then it's gone. Now, not to say it's gone completely, they probably keep it, but it's not available publicly. Supposedly, the Library of Congress is making the data available. We've contacted them over and over again for that, and it's not the case. In fact, they've received one single dump of Twitter data covering about a year and no more. And so there's a project at stake here, which is archiving social media data, especially on news events. And this was one of the questions that I've been thinking a lot about is what counts as an event? When do you start archiving? What do you archive? And we archived around 440,000 tweets over a 2-week period from Egypt. There are about 40,000 unique tweeters, just in terms of statistics. I think that's pretty interesting because, so you see this idea of like the unknown future. I mean, it's really quite, it's somewhat, it's really moving in some ways to see an event unfold this was even more moving to watch in real time. One of this was actually something that received a lot of attention within the Twitter universe because people were tuning in to watch Twitter carry the revolution live via projects like this, a visualization project. And so it was, as much as you can watch CNN and you listen to reporters talking to 3 or 4 people in Tahrir Square, I'm listening to 40,000 people tweeting about their events, and these are coming in constantly. And so it was really quite interesting project. We did this with right after the tsunami in Japan, and there I was working with, I should say this information about this project. There's 3 of us behind it, not just me. Yoko Ono is our campus JS coordinator, and David Shepard is an English grad student who's the technical team leader. And we've done this with a number of small events, commemorative events, Anzac Day in New Zealand, for example. We've done this with Libya for quite a long time. And there it's primarily journalists who are tweeting. So most of it's in English. Here, I think it's a wide range. We don't know, we can talk about the reliability of the data. I mean, I don't know if it's all reliable. I mean, I haven't had a chance to look at it all. I have people poring over it now. But even if just say a fourth of it's reliable, it's really quite a stunning amount of public discourse about the history of the present, in the present today. So that's where I think I'll stop, because I've already spoken for now at least 40 minutes, and I'm happy to entertain questions that kind of bridge what the digital humanities might be doing. But I think in every case, just to sum up, I think it's about adding depth and complexity, interpretive depth and complexity to the human record. That's what the digital humanities can do, utilizing the possibilities of new technologies. So I'll end there. Thanks.